Welcome to The Political Bridge, the podcast dedicated to fostering informed and respectful dialogue across the political spectrum. I'm your host, Ada. Today we're tackling a perennial debate that strikes at the heart of our representative democracy: congressional term limits. The idea of limiting how long our elected officials can serve in Congress has gained significant traction, often framed as a way to combat stagnation, reduce the influence of special interests, and bring fresh perspectives to Washington. However, opponents argue that term limits strip Congress of invaluable institutional knowledge, weaken its ability to oversee the executive branch, and empower unelected staff and lobbyists. We'll explore whether term limits are a necessary reform to revitalize our legislative body or a misguided attempt that would ultimately undermine its effectiveness. Joining me to dissect this complex issue are our regular panelists, Nico and Jordan. Nico, let's start with your opening thoughts on congressional term limits.
Thank you, Ada. The case for congressional term limits is overwhelmingly strong. Our founders envisioned a citizen legislature, not a professional political class. Long-serving politicians often become detached from their constituents, prioritizing re-election and personal power over public service. Data suggests that incumbent re-election rates in the House of Representatives consistently hover above 90%, creating a stagnant environment where new ideas struggle to emerge. This seniority system concentrates power in the hands of a few, leading to legislative gridlock and a lack of accountability. Term limits, perhaps 2 or 3 terms for House members and 2 for senators, would force a regular infusion of new blood, bringing diverse professional experiences and a greater urgency to address pressing issues. It would reduce the influence of lobbyists who cultivate long-term relationships, and it would encourage representatives to focus on policy, not just political survival. Look at states like California, which implemented term limits in the 1990s. It saw a significant increase in legislative turnover and new leadership opportunities. This isn't about discarding experience. It's about ensuring dynamic representation.
Nico, while the appeal of new blood is understandable, the practical consequences of congressional term limits would be deeply detrimental to effective governance. Limiting terms would systematically strip Congress of institutional knowledge and expertise, leaving a vacuum that would inevitably be filled by unelected, unaccountable lobbyists, congressional staff, and executive branch bureaucrats. Imagine the House Appropriations Committee, responsible for allocating trillions of dollars, being constantly staffed by members still learning the ropes. This would weaken Congress's oversight capacity, making it less effective in holding the executive branch accountable, regardless of whether it's the Trump administration or a future one. Furthermore, term limits would diminish the power of voters to choose who represents them, disenfranchising communities that value the experience and proven track record of their long-serving representatives. The idea that long tenure automatically leads to corruption is a cynical oversimplification. Often it leads to a deeper understanding of complex policy and a greater ability to build coalitions. We need more effective campaigning finance reform, not arbitrary limits on democratic choice.
Both of you have laid out compelling initial arguments. Nico, you emphasize the need for fresh perspectives and reduced influence of entrenched interests, pointing to high incumbent re-election rates. Jordan, you highlight the critical role of institutional knowledge and the potential for term limits to empower unelected actors, while also stressing voter choice. My first follow-up question builds on this. How do we balance the undeniable desire for responsive, dynamic representation with the equally vital need for legislative expertise and continuity? Is there a middle ground, or are we facing a zero-sum choice between these two fundamental values in our democracy? Nico, let's start with you on this.
Ada, it's not a zero-sum game. The balance lies in recognizing that experience isn't solely derived from decades in Washington. Expertise can be brought in from the private sector, academia, state and local government, and even through a more diverse array of life experiences. Term limits would encourage a more fluid movement between public service and other fields, enriching the legislative process. The institutional knowledge argument often serves as a shield for incumbents who have become comfortable and less innovative. Yes, there's a learning curve, but new members are often highly motivated to learn quickly, and they bring a fresh perspective to old problems. The idea that unelected staff would gain undue power is a concern, but it also highlights a deeper problem: the over-reliance on staff due to the complexity of legislation. Term limits could incentivize Congress to simplify processes and empower members to be more directly involved. Moreover, the current system often sees members retire into lucrative lobbying roles anyway, leveraging their long-standing connections. Term limits could mitigate this revolving door by making those connections less valuable over time, as the faces in Congress change more frequently. It's about prioritizing the public interest over career politicians.
Nico, your optimism about new members quickly acquiring complex legislative knowledge is, frankly, unrealistic. The intricacies of federal budgeting, international relations, or healthcare policy are not mastered overnight. When former President Biden was a senator, his decades of experience in foreign policy were invaluable. To dismiss this as mere comfort or lack of innovation is to ignore the depth of understanding required to craft effective, durable legislation. The claim that term limits would reduce the revolving door is also speculative. Lobbyists would simply shift their focus to cultivating relationships with incoming members and their staff, or even target the executive branch more aggressively. The power would simply transfer, not disappear. Furthermore, term limits could lead to a lame duck problem, where representatives nearing their term limits become less accountable to voters and more susceptible to special interests, knowing they won't face re-election. This undermines democratic accountability, not enhances it. Voters should have the ultimate say on who represents them, and if they value a member's experience, they should be free to re-elect them. We need to empower voters, not restrict their choices.
This brings us to a critical juncture. Nico, your argument hinges on the idea that term limits would significantly reduce the influence of special interests and lobbyists by disrupting long-term relationships. However, Jordan just raised a point that term limits might simply shift lobbying efforts to new targets or even empower the executive branch further. Nico, how do you directly address the contention that term limits might not curb special interest influence, but merely redirect it, potentially making it harder for new, less experienced members to resist? And Jordan, your core argument is that institutional knowledge is paramount. Yet you haven't fully addressed the concern that this very seniority system can lead to stagnation and a disconnect from the evolving needs of constituents, creating a less responsive legislature. How do we ensure that valuing experience doesn't inadvertently entrench outdated approaches and unresponsive governance?
Ada, the claim that lobbying would simply redirect misses a crucial point. The power of long-term relationships is precisely what makes lobbying so effective today. When a lobbyist has cultivated a relationship with a committee chair over 2 decades, that access and influence are profoundly different from trying to build rapport with a new member every few years. While lobbyists would certainly adapt, the constant turnover would make their job significantly harder and less efficient. It would force them to invest more in educating new members about issues rather than leveraging established personal ties. Moreover, term limits would encourage members to prioritize their legislative legacy within a defined time frame, rather than focusing on a perpetual re-election campaign. This shift in focus could make them less susceptible to the long-term influence peddling that defines much of Washington today. It's not a perfect solution, but it's a significant step towards breaking the cycle of entrenched influence. The current system provides a stable, predictable target for special interests. Term limits introduce a necessary element of unpredictability and dynamism.
Ada, the concern about stagnation is valid, but term limits are a blunt instrument that would cause more harm than good. The solution isn't to discard experience, but to implement reforms that encourage responsiveness and accountability within the existing framework. For instance, robust campaign finance reform would reduce the influence of money in politics, allowing challengers to compete more effectively and preventing incumbents from becoming complacent. We could also explore reforms to committee assignments and leadership selection processes to ensure that power is distributed more broadly and that new voices can rise more quickly. Furthermore, an engaged and informed electorate is the ultimate check on unresponsive governance. If constituents feel their representative is out of touch, they have the power to vote them out. The problem isn't the potential for long tenure, but the systemic barriers that prevent effective challenges. President Trump's election, for example, demonstrated a strong desire for change, which voters expressed through the ballot box. We should empower that democratic process, not limit it by imposing arbitrary restrictions on who can serve.
Our stress test round has truly illuminated the core tension here: the desire to curb entrenched power and foster dynamism versus the imperative to maintain legislative effectiveness and respect voter choice. Nico, you argue that term limits would fundamentally alter the lobbying landscape, making it harder for special interests, while Jordan contends that the value of institutional knowledge outweighs the risks of stagnation, advocating for other reforms. This debate isn't merely about policy, it's about the very nature of representation and the balance of power in our government. Nico, let's turn to your closing argument incorporating what we've discussed.
Ada, Jordan's arguments, while well-intentioned, ultimately defend a broken status quo. The current system, characterized by career politicians and entrenched interests, has led to a Congress that is often perceived as unresponsive and ineffective. While campaign finance reform is important, it doesn't address the fundamental issue of a political class that becomes insulated from the realities of everyday Americans. Term limits offer a direct and powerful mechanism to redemocratize Congress. They would ensure a constant influx of citizens with real-world experience, making the legislature more reflective of the diverse perspectives of the nation. The argument about loss of institutional knowledge often overstates its impact. Much of that knowledge resides with professional staff and nonpartisan agencies, and new members are fully capable of learning and adapting. What we lose in decades of tenure, we gain in vitality, accountability, and a renewed focus on public service over political careerism. It's about restoring the principle that public office is a temporary trust, not a permanent profession. We need to empower the citizenry, not just the incumbents.
Nico, your vision of a constantly rotating Congress, while appealing in its idealism, overlooks the profound practical challenges and potential for legislative chaos. The idea that institutional knowledge is easily replaceable or primarily held by staff undermines the critical role of experienced legislators in crafting nuanced policy, building bipartisan consensus, and providing robust oversight. Imagine the complexities of negotiating a budget or a trade agreement with a legislative body constantly in flux. This would inevitably shift power to the executive branch, regardless of who is president, and to unelected bureaucrats and lobbyists who possess the very long-term expertise Congress would be shedding. Voters deserve the right to choose their representatives based on merit, experience, and their track record, not to have those choices arbitrarily limited by a one-size-fits-all rule. Instead of term limits, we should focus on strengthening democratic institutions through campaign finance reform, promoting civic engagement, and fostering a political culture that values both experience and fresh ideas. True reform empowers voters, it doesn't restrict them.
And that brings us to the end of another thought-provoking discussion on the political bridge.